African time, would like to welcome you to ChatBack for the second installment. Like I alluded to a little earlier today, I've been joined by Ochizi. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
All right. Now, I definitely have to set the tone of our interaction for today. To those of you that are actually tuning in and wondering what we're looking at. Now, we're discussing Zambia's debt levels, and Zambia's debt levels have actually been increasing at a rapid pace over the past few years, and high public debt levels have negative implications on an economy contributing to slow economic growth, which is an established fact. And the Ministry of Finance recently announced that Zambia's debt levels are currently at 11.2 billion US dollars. That's a staggering, I must add, 11.2 billion US dollars as at end of December 2019. And domestic debt was recorded at 80.2 billion kwacha. Now, the speed of debt contraction led to the IMF declaring Zambia being at high risk of debt distress. That was in 2017. All right. Now, this means that Zambia's capacity to pay back its debt is becoming questionable, and the likelihood of the country defaulting on its debt is very high. And various stakeholders have thereby become concerned, one of which are Cards International themselves. The Zambia's debt is becoming a burden on the economy instead of driving economic growth. You find yourself in a situation where instead of channeling all the necessary resources to economic growth, you probably find yourself in trying to service your debt. A classic example is if you're heavily indebted, you may not, as if you're heavily indebted as a family of six, every little monies that come to your account at the end of the month as salary, part of which will probably go to debt servicing, and that might affect what you buy for your children at home and how you spend, or probably whatever commodities you might want to buy, for that particular home. If you're used to getting your children cornflakes, bread, and bacon every morning, you may have to cut to size, start giving them something that is meager in trying to spare a little bit of money, for debt servicing. Now, one potential way to help deal with Zambia's debt situation is through a strong legal environment guiding public debt acquisition. And today's program discusses Zambia's debt legal environment. All right. And as I alluded to a little earlier, I have the program officer and the research assistant from Cards International. All right, let me start with you, Kangwa. Can you give details about the country's debt levels over the past years and the debt composition?
Yeah. Okay. In terms of the country's debt levels, as you had indicated in your introduction, the debt levels have been on the rise rapidly over the past few years. Currently, like you indicated, for external debt alone, we are at about 11 billion US dollars. And if we're looking at where we're coming from, let's say, for instance, 10 years ago, our debt levels were only at about 1 billion US dollars. So if we are looking at this in terms of a percentage increase, in terms of our external debt levels, this is equivalent to an increase of about 578% within the past 10 years, a very, very significant increase. And this has been, the trend over the past years, 2010, 11, 12, 13, way up to where we are now. For instance, in 2015, it was at 6.4 billion US dollars, and now it's at 11. So again, this goes to show that each and every year we have been accumulating high levels of debt. The debt levels were recorded at 80.2 billion kwacha, and this is increasing from 54 billion kwacha in 2018. So just in a space of 1 year, we accumulated about almost 30 billion kwacha in terms of domestic debt just in the space of a year. If you go back until maybe the last 10 years, 2010, these levels were about 10 billion kwacha. So again, that is a rapid rise. We are accumulating debt at a rather high pace, and this is actually worrying because it talk about the external debt composition, because this has changed significantly over the years as well. In terms of debt composition, this is what is known as debt from multilateral institutions. These are institutions such as, the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, which consists of various governments putting money together. Then there's also bilateral debt, which is just basically debt from between two countries, individual countries. And then there's also what is known as export and suppliers credit, which is simply an exporter supplying goods or services on credit terms. Then lastly, there's what is known as commercial debt, which is simply debt obtained from international markets. Now, what's important about when it comes to the composition of debt is the composition of Zambia's debt in particular has shifted from multilateral debt, which was fairly cheap and affordable, given at almost even sometimes 0% interest rates, to commercial debt, which is quite expensive. And when we look at this composition, it's mainly because when Zambia was declared a low to middle income state, it didn't really qualify to have access to multilateral cheaper debt. So now our debt portfolio has become quite complicated and quite expensive, and this has put strain and pressure on the government's position to pay back.
Okay, all right. Well, Chizi, I want you to come in as well on this very point on the country's debt levels over the last few years. Quite discouraging and disheartening, if you may ask me. How do you chime in on that one before I move on to my next point?
Yes, I think I can agree with you on the fact that it's quite discouraging and it's concerning for us as the Zambian citizens. I think you mentioned how debt is at 11.2%.
Absolutely.
Last year, about end of June, our debt levels were at 10.2%, and $10.2 billion. Sorry. This shows that our debt has increased by $1 billion in the space of
quite
6
high.
months. Yes,
so very high.
Which is very high for the short period of time we're looking at here. And then also just add on to what Kangwa said about our commercial borrowing. This became very popular around 2012. So since 2012, we've seen a sharp increase in commercial borrowing, which has increased and made our debt portfolio a bit more diverse from what it used to be, which shows that we need to make adjustments to these new changes in the markets.
Okay, all right. Let me start with you on my next question, Uchizi, and then Kangwa will chip in. What are some of the implications of high public debt levels for a country like ours?
Yeah, so the implications, as you alluded to earlier, you talked about a household of six and how they have a salary and a fixed salary, and then increasing to So looking at the country's debt levels, basically the government, with the increasing debt servicing that we have, they have less and less to spend every year. So just to give an example, the minister earlier this year, he mentioned that after paying debt servicing and salaries for civil servants, the government is left with about 10% to spend on other services that they provide. For instance, healthcare and education, agriculture, all of which have been reducing. If you look at the budget allocations over the years, the percentage allocation in the budgets for agriculture, healthcare, education have all been decreasing in recent years, which shows that debt servicing is squeezing what the government can spend, because debt servicing is increasing as the years go by. I'll give an example of our Eurobond, for example. There's one that's due in 2022. So that's very close. We're in 2020 now,
2 years.
less than 2 years. That has to be paid back. So which increases pressure on the government to pay back, and they basically redistribute their funds from what they should be spending money on to debt servicing.
Okay. All right, Kangwa, your take on the implications and ramifications of high debt levels for a country like ours?
Yeah. I mean, just to add on to what Chizi said, I think also beyond leaving the government with less capacity to spend in key public services.
Mhm.
There's also the issue of, economic challenges. For instance, when we have high debt levels, we're not seen as a very attractive destination in terms of investments from investors. So this affects the demand of the kwacha, and thereby it has implications on the strength of the kwacha, and thereby we see the kwacha depreciating. As we all know, the kwacha is now at, I think, a
1 to 16.
1 to 16. So it's that could one of the reasons I could actually attribute to the
fall of the
kwacha is actually our targets should be about, the government target is about 7 to 8%, single digit inflation. But at the moment, inflation is about 12%, if I'm not mistaken.
Back in double digits.
Back in double digits, you see. So this has implications, therefore, on the cost of living for citizens and the cost of doing business as well. So it again worsens the welfare of citizens if the cost of goods and services are high. How do people do businesses if the exchange rate is extremely high? Then also in terms of business, again, when the government has high debt levels, it affects their ability to pay back arrears to various contractors and suppliers. So when you affect a business, a local person's business, by not being able to pay them on time, it affects their ability to grow, to expand, and this can lead to businesses laying off workers. It can lead to businesses, even in the worst circumstances, even shutting down. So you see, the implications of public debt are at all levels. It affects consumers because now we have to spend more on goods and services, and it also has an implication on businesses. So the implications are felt at various levels, and this really needs to be addressed because it threatens to make economic conditions worse, for the general citizenry.
Okay, all right. Buchizi?
Also, just to add, another implication from high debt will be the government will try to increase the amount of revenue they collect from the citizens. So through taxes and fees and non-tax revenues, the government will think of new ways to tax the public and increase their revenues so they can pay back their debt. So you hear people say things like, it's the citizens that pay back the debt, which is kind of true essentially, because we are the ones who pay tax, and then the government uses our tax to pay back their debt. So it's our debt essentially.
So basically, they borrow, we pay.
Yeah.
Very unfortunate. Such a vicious evil cycle. You may want to put it that way.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Now, Ochizi, then Kangwa again. What is the public debt management? What is basically public debt management, and why is it that important? I start with Kangwa.
So public debt management is basically the strategies that are put in place to manage a country's debt in order to raise, debt levels at the lowest possible cost, and also at the lowest possible risk. I think it's important that, when you borrow, you don't just borrow anyhow. You have to have some kind of strategies that are put in place to ensure that borrowing is done at a sustainable pace, and that also that borrowed money is used prudently. So public debt management is basically important just to ensure that the manner in which the government acquires debt is done in a prudent way and is channeled in a way that will enable it to pay back, and also in productive sectors that will bring about and spur economic growth. So it's basically just the strategies that are put in place to ensure that debt is managed prudently.
Okay, all right. Ochizi, what to make of Zambia's public debt management mechanism? All right, if at all we have one, and I guess we do have one, don't we? All right.
Yes, we do. We do have a public debt mechanism.
Management mechanism.
Yes. So in Zambia, we've got a number of different legislations and laws that guide our public debt management. So to start with, we'll talk about the Constitution, which is basically the supreme law of the land, as they say. the Constitution for public debt distributes political and structural powers to other to ministries and the people who deal with the debt, Ministry of Finance particularly. And then we also have the Loans and Guarantees Act, which contains and prescribed debt level, contains prescribed debt management laws, and also has laws for how government gets loans, and treasury security laws, and institutional and operational laws and instructions relating to public debt.
Okay. All right. Now, Kangwa, before I probably ask you to just comment upon our public debt management system or mechanism, if the Minister of Finance wants to contract debt in Zambia, let's probably try to educate those that may not know about the system and how it works. If government wants to contract debt in Zambia, how do they go about it? All right. Kindly run us through what is currently contained in the structure of debt contraction for our country.
Okay. According to the primary legislation that governs public debt acquisition, which is the Loans and Guarantees Authorization Act of 1998. So, for instance, if a spending agency would like a spending agency, this can be a ministry or whatnot, can come up to the Ministry of Finance and apply for a specific loan. So the Minister of Finance, the procedure is actually quite simple. The Minister of Finance simply goes to Cabinet, and the Cabinet can either approve or disapprove if this loan can go through. Now, what is a bit confusing about this is that the Constitution itself says something else. The Constitution says that before a loan should be approved, it should be before a loan is contracted, it should be approved by National Assembly,
Parliament,
by Parliament. Yes, but this is not the case. So when a loan is, when the Minister of Finance desires to get a loan, it simply goes through Cabinet
and not Parliament.
And so when Cabinet approves this loan can be contracted.
Now, what's your cases as opposed to Parliament?
Yeah, I think it's a discrepancy. It's definitely a discrepancy, and it's something that could be one of the reasons why we
find ourselves in this
situation. Yeah, because there's little accountability in terms of, first of all, what debt was used for, and it's increased at such a rapid pace, but we are not it's not really known what the debt was used for. We've got 3 Eurobonds in a very short time, in 2012, 2014, and I think 2015 as well, what, $3 billion US. But do we know what those Eurobonds were used for? I know the first one was supposed to be used for the recapitalization of Zambia Railways. But what is the status of Zambia Railways now?
It's pathetic.
Exactly. So if there was that that oversight by National Assembly all these years, I think, first of all, the levels at which we would have contracted the debt would have been a little bit slower, and we would have more accountability and transparency in terms of how exactly exactly the debt has been managed. But because of that, we don't know exactly how the debt has been managed, and yet we have got a very big bill to pay very soon, and we have the limited capacity to do so. So this in itself is a very big weakness in terms of the legal framework governing the country's debt.
All right, Ochizi in part answered my next question, but I would want to get your version as well, Kangwa. Kindly give us a brief description of some of the different pieces of legislation guiding our public debt. All right. I want you to pick it up from there, and then maybe Cheese can chip in as well.
Yeah, I think he started talking about the Constitution. Currently, we're still on the Constitution Act number 2 of 2016, which basically gives the mandate to borrow. So it gives general provisions to borrow. But like I indicated, the primary piece of legislation itself is the Loans and Guarantees Authorization Act of 1994. So this one, it gives detailed processes in terms of how exactly the borrowing process is supposed to take place. But there's also what is known there's also the Public Finance Management Act, and this one mainly is to do with the utilization of public funds. It was recently enacted in 2018. And so these are the main three pieces of legislation which govern public debt. There are other subsidiary pieces which look at especially domestic borrowing, but overall, I think these are the main three pieces of legislation.
Okay. If you want to call us, the number is 0960-200-490, and then I'll be able to put you through at a push of a button. So that is 0960-200-490. You can also send your text messages on the same number, and then I'll be able to read your thoughts. So that is 0960-200-490. All right, now, Ochizi, what gaps and weaknesses have you identified in the current public debt legislation?
Yeah, so in terms of gaps and weaknesses, I think Kangwa mentioned the discrepancy between the Loans and Guarantees Act and the Constitution. So the Loans and Guarantees Act would give mandate to cabinet to contract debt, while the Constitution gives authority to the National Assembly. So there's that discrepancy between who really has the mandate to borrow and to contract debt. And then also looking at the actual definition of public debt, between the three legislations we've mentioned, the Loans and Guarantees, the Constitution, and the Public Finance Management Act, the definition of public debt isn't the same in all of them. For instance, the Constitution doesn't mention whether or not guarantees are included in public debt. So the government gives guarantees to other state-owned enterprises to contract debt, but it's not clear whether that is in the definition of public debt when you look at the Constitution. While in the Loans and Guarantees Act, they do mention guarantees, and also in the Public Finance Management Act, guarantees are mentioned. So there's a bit of confusion between what exactly public debt is from a legal point of view. And then also looking at a weakness, I guess, would be looking at our debt ceilings. The debt ceilings are given as a fixed number, which could be looked at as a weakness as well, because it doesn't really take into account economic performance. If you just have one fixed figure every year, and your economy is doing bad, you can still contract that same amount of money. So that could be looked at as a weakness. And then also our government, when contracting debt, we don't look at the effect that crowding out would have on the domestic economy. So when the government contracts debt from the domestic economy, they borrow from banks, for instance, which basically reduces the amount the private sector can borrow from the domestic economy. So it basically crowds them out, it pushes them out of what they can borrow. So that's another issue which should be taken into consideration when contracting debt, the crowding out effect.
All right. Kangwa, your take on that one, gaps and weaknesses that you've identified personally in the current public debt legislation?
Just to add on to what my colleague Ochizi has already indicated, another major gap within the public debt legislation, I think, is to do with issues of transparency and accountability. The law does not give guidance on what kind of information should be availed to the public in terms of public debt. For instance, if you want to know the Eurobond, at what interest rate it was borrowed, that information is not there. What was the Eurobond used for? That information is not there. So there's very little information in terms of the debt specifics with regards to, in terms of the debt specifics. And this, it puts us in a difficult position to hold the government accountable. So this is something that we feel should be included in the law to strengthen the management of, to strengthen public debt management. Another thing that also appears to be a weakness is what we can say the authority to conduct debt management activities. What do I mean by debt management activities? Things like debt sustainability analysis. If you've been following the issue of DSAs in the country, a debt sustainability analysis, maybe just by way of definition, is used to help assess how sustainable the country's debt is. So in Zambia, I think there was one time under the former Minister of Finance, Margaret Manakatwe, where a debt sustainability analysis was conducted, but it was not even publicized. I think the minister even indicated that it would not even be publicized. So usually we depend on the DSAs that are done by institutions like the International Monetary Fund, and the government in itself is not mandated to conduct these debt sustainability analysis. So it makes us wonder as to how we are basing our borrowing when we don't even know how sustainable, the country's debt is. So this is something that we see as a weakness. Then another thing that we see as a weakness is also there's no mandate to have in the law to have medium-term debt management strategies. We had a medium-term. We're supposed to have a new one now in 2020, and we haven't had anything yet. But if we had, these things in the law, then I think it would it would ensure that debt management is done in a more prudent way. But because we don't have these things mandated in the law, it's done in a rather ad hoc manner. Maybe this year we won't hear, we don't know next if we'll hear, or there's no guarantee if we'll hear about it. I think we'll be in a better position to manage our debt more prudently.
Okay. All right, Ochizi, what recommendations then would you have going forward in kind of like covering up these gaps and strengthening these weaknesses in the current public debt legislation?
Okay, so I'll speak about the weaknesses I identified. So looking at, I mentioned the debt ceilings. I guess a recommendation for that one would be for government to take the debt ceilings as a percentage of our GDP, for instance, so that it varies depending on how our economy is performing. So that if we're performing badly, for instance, it reduces the amount of debt that they can contract for that year, hence reducing the debt ceiling, or adjusting the debt ceiling according to how our economy is doing. And then secondly, in our laws, I think we can widen the scope of public debt to include state-owned enterprises and guaranteed debt. And if we just align definition of public debt across all our legal framework, I think it will make it easier for us to measure our public debt going forward, and it also make things more consistent across the board. And then I talked about the crowding out effect. So in other countries, for instance, in Kenya, before debt is contracted, there's an assessment done by the central bank, if I'm not mistaken, and they look at the effect that contracting debt would have on the domestic economy before the debt is contracted. So I think if we align our monetary and fiscal policies to look at that effect in the Zambian economy, I think that would help us manage more accountably and
Okay, going forward.
Yeah, going forward.
All right, Akangwa, what are your recommendations from your point of view to these gaps and weaknesses in our debt contract in our public debt legislation?
Yeah. I think also based on the weaknesses that we identified, I think the first one is that the primary legislation, the Loans and the Guarantees Authorization Act, needs to be amended. Like we indicated, this is quite an old piece of legislation, and a lot has happened in terms of, the composition of our debt, how we're acquiring debt, where we're acquiring debt from has significantly changed. So this piece of legislation, I think, needs to be amended to cater for, the current situation. As we indicated, the issue of the discrepancy of National Assembly and cabinet in the final say of borrowing, this needs to be dealt with in the legislation. The Loans and Guarantees Act needs to be in line with the Constitution in terms of who has the final say with regards to authority of approving public debt. If National Assembly has the final say and authority, we see this as a way in which debt can be managed in a more accountable manner, and it could prevent unnecessary contraction of debt if it's debated in Parliament. Then also the issue of transparency and accountability. Well, the view that the law needs to include more frequent publication of information and data related to debt. Then need this data, the details of Zambia's debt needs to be in the open, and it should be easily accessible, so that citizens and the various organizations can be able to hold the government to account. So if the government's debt is made to be more transparent, we have the view that it could help improve debt to be managed more prudently. Then also, like I was indicating, the issue of debt sustainability analysis and medium-term debt strategies, these should be mandated in the law, so that we don't have a situation where, for example, last time the debt sustainability analysis was not publicized, and also the medium-term debt management strategy was hardly implemented. So if these things are mandated in the law, and of course, if there are punitive measures in which if the various provisions are not implemented, people can face the law, then I think it would strengthen the environment in which debt is managed, and would possibly see debt going to prudent levels and also being channeled in the right ways.
Okay, all right. Now, as we probably approach the final third of our discussion, let me start with you, Uchizi. What could be your final remarks, your clarion call, all right, on this particular subject of Zambia's debt contraction levels and all?
Yeah, so I guess my final say would be, I think debt should be an issue that everyone should be concerned about, considering the rate at which we are contracting debt. I think, remember I mentioned how in the last 6 months it's increased, external debt has increased by over $1 billion, which is alarming. But I feel like people are not aware of how much debt we're actually contracting. And if not checked, it won't stop, in my opinion. And as the IMF already categorized us at a high risk of debt distress, if we continue at this rate, we will reach debt distress. I guess we will be in a situation that is almost irreversible and will take years to fix. So I think debt management is something that is concerning, and we should continue to keep the government accountable for how they
scoring. Okay, in this case, our government is the public consulted, because at the end of the day, it's the public that pays for that debt.
Yeah.
Now, it seems ironic that they may, according to my knowledge, they may not be consulted. What's your take on that?
The public is actually not consulted when it comes to debt acquisition. At no stage is it consulted, because, like I indicated, it only goes through cabinet. So at no point is the general public actually consulted when the country wants to contract.
Yet they're the ones who pay for it.
Exactly, through higher taxes and other ways. So at no point is the public actually consulted when it comes to debt acquisition.
Okay. Now, could that be practical? Imagine if the public were to be consulted. Let me start with you, Cheesy, then I'll get back to you, Kango. How practical is consulting the public before contracting debts? Because that is the question that people in government will be asking us. Like, come on, it's impractical.
I guess it is impractical to talk to individuals about about how we contract debt. But I think that's why we have in our democratic system, we've got elected people, our members of parliament. So if you look at countries like South Africa, the terms of debt contraction, the terms and conditions of debt contraction are debated in parliament before they're contracted. While in Zambia, as Kangwa alluded to, it's only the cabinet, the ministers, who aren't elected per se. So I think when it comes to the public, it would be nice if we could make it public, how the debt is spent, how the money is spent, and our current debt position. But I think when it comes to contraction, members of parliament should be able to suffice and represent the public effectively.
All right, so Kangwa, where will the government find time to consult the public? That could probably be another question in looking at the practicability of it all.
Yeah, I think that might not be very practical. So I have to also agree with what Uchidi is saying. I think the best bet is to have National Assembly, debate over debt contraction. I think that can be the most practical way to do it, because I can imagine every time the government wants to borrow a loan and they have to have big scrutiny over it. It might take a lot of time, and at the end of the day, you might not even achieve consensus. So I think it's better if it's actually, I think National Assembly oversight should be sufficient, to represent the views of the people in terms of loan contraction.
Yeah. Let me get at least this gentleman coming through. All right. You're through to ChatBack. Good morning. Is that Morgan? Please go ahead, Morgan, and speak a little louder.
I think I just wanted to comment on the ratio of consulting the general public. I think that might be somehow difficult because you see the general population, we are almost 17 million, maybe those who are able to understand the things, roughly about 10 million. But I think it might be somehow difficult. So the first way is maybe to give parliament power to like the levy and the category, also the issue of making sure that the money that we contract, the safety power to see that it is made to the state properly, and also it will bring in checks and balances in the area of that question. Something that is supposed to cost 5 million is not inflated. I think that is those areas you can give power to our education.
Okay, thank you for coming through. All right, okay, somewhat in agreement with what you're saying. All right, so let's probably get your concluding remarks, Kangwa, on the same. All right, on this particular topic. Quite interesting thoughts really coming through, and we seem to be headed towards a situation where we may just be contracting debt, unrelentingly, so to say. So how do you wrap up today's discussion, Kangwa?
Just say our debt levels have been increasing at a very alarming pace, and there are various solutions that I think that are actually well documented in terms of how the government can actually rectify the situation. But I think for us today, our main message is that the legal framework that governs public debt, there are a lot of loopholes, and the legal framework needs to be revised, urgently, because if these loopholes are not addressed, and let's say miraculously we get our debt levels back to sustainable levels, we could see a situation again where they could rapidly rise. So we need to deal with the various pieces of legislation that govern the country's debt in order to prevent debt crisis, and also to help get the country's debt levels back to, they're now at high risk levels according to the IMF, but not to get them at least back to moderate levels. We need to deal with the legal environment.
Technically, are we back at the HIPIC levels of debts?
Are we at the HIPIC levels? We are not at the HIPIC levels in terms of the amount. I don't think we've reached the amount, but we're getting there.
Slowly getting there. All right. Okay. So that is all we had on the program today. We hope to carry on with this discussion in the next few weeks, if not a month or so.